Welcome, Gunrunner.
If you mention the words BBC Micro to a British person of a certain age, then you will no doubt see their eyes light up with nostalgia. Although the Beeb, as it is affectionately known, was far from the most popular home computer in the UK, it could be found in almost every school, which is where most of us experienced one, whether that be a bit of Granny's garden with your friends in junior school, or sneaking in a quick play on Chucky Egg when you should have been working on your senior school computer studies class. The BBC was not only a huge influence on us British children, it also had a huge impact on the industry too, introducing many new and unique features in terms of its design, which would leave an unparalleled legacy on the industry that takes us right into the present day and the mobile device you're probably watching this on. People talk about the influence the ZX Spectrum had on the industry in the UK by virtue of its low cost and huge popularity as a games machine, but it can't compete with the BBC Micro when it comes to its legacy in the home computing and technology world. And that's why I'm so pleased that the BBC Micro won my latest Amazing Facts poll, and it certainly wasn't close either, as it convincingly beat the second place Sinclair QL, which rather ironically was created to directly compete with it, and in many ways this was the easiest Amazing Facts video I've ever made, because there is just so many tantalising tidbits and trivia about the Beeb, but in some ways it was also the hardest one to make too, as I had to keep it down to 10 and decide what to leave out. Now let's have a look at the 10 I whittled it down to then, shall we, and you can be the judge of whether I did it justice.
This is the story of Daphne, who longs to be alone with her very own BBC Micro. Alas for Daphne, Acorn have also made it rather attractive to small businessmen.
Hello, Dad.
Tragically, they've even made it irresistible to accountants.
Hello, Uncle Cyril.
Just get going.
And sad to say, it's become vital for everyone who needs up-to-the-minute information, thanks to its Prestel and Teletext adapters. Worst of all, it's absolutely bung-ho for busy administrators. And then there are those visitors who want to use its unearthly scientific potential. Poor Daphne. The BBC microcomputer system is a world leader, and it's still growing.
During the early 80s, the British Broadcasting Corporation started what became known as the BBC Computer Literacy Project. This project was initiated partly in response to an ITV documentary series called The Mighty Micro, which predicted the coming microcomputer revolution and its effect on not just the UK economy and technology industry, but also people's home life. The BBC wanted to design its project around a microcomputer capable of performing a series of quite specific tasks that they could demonstrate on a new TV series called The Computer Programme. The list of topics would include programming, graphics, sound and music, teletext, controlling external hardware, and even artificial intelligence. The company created a rather ambitious specification for a BBC branded computer, which they insisted must be built by a British company. This led them to speak to several industry leaders in this sector, including the likes of Newbury Laboratories, Tangerine Computer Systems, and most notably Sinclair Research. But it was another new upstart company that came out of nowhere to take the contract, which most people had already assumed would be granted to Sinclair. That company was Acorn, led by former Sinclair employee Chris Curry. They were already working on a computer as a successor to the Atom, more on that later, that met most of these specs already. While the machine in the works at Sinclair, then called the ZX82 but eventually released as a Spectrum, was lacking in many areas and would require a radical rethink in its design in order to meet the BBC spec. The new Acorn machine was codenamed the Proton, but was eventually chosen to be the new BBC Micro, much to the fury of Sir Clive Sinclair, as shown, albeit rather dramatically, in the brilliant BBC produced film The Micro Men. The Acorn team, which included both Steve Ferber and Sophie Wilson, were given 1 week to build a working prototype from the sketch designs and deliver a presentation of it to the BBC. The team worked through the night to get a working proton together for this meeting and somehow succeeded. In fact, people representing the BBC commented that the proton not only met all of their specifications, but actually exceeded them in many areas. Acorn and the BBC signed a contract in February 1981, and by June that year the final specs for the BBC Micro and its pricing had been decided. The BBC Micro was officially launched in December 1981 and rolled out to UK schools the following year. I already mentioned the Acorn Atom in the previous segment, so I felt I should give it an entry of its own to explain its significance in the BBC Micro story and the influence it had on what came after. Launched in 1979, the Atom was Acorn's first proper home computer and had an interesting design that was very much aimed at the computer hobbyist. This was very much demonstrated by the way it could either be bought as a kit, which you had to build and solder yourself, or ready and complete. The Atom was based around an MOS Technology 6502 CPU, much like the BBC Micro, and came with 2K of expandable RAM and monochrome graphics, although a colour card was later produced that upped this to a massive 4. In fact, add-on boards like this very much demonstrated the hobbyist feel of the machine. It came with Acorn Basic built in, which was considered a very advanced version of the language for the time, and a number of different display modes. These weren't the only similarities with the BBC Micro, however, as you'll also notice a lot of familiar aspects in its external design. The Atom never really had the widespread success of many of its rivals like the Sinclair ZX81, Atari 8-bit and Commodore VIC-20, mainly due to its hobbyist niche, but there's no doubting that it built all the groundwork for the BBC Micro that would follow, and without the Atom, there's no way Acorn would have been able to develop its successor so quickly. One of the most influential aspects of the BBC Micro was its ability to create and display teletext through its Mode 7 graphics and specifically designed Teletext adapter, which was included as standard on later models of the computer like the BBC Master. This was created to power the BBC's CFAX service, which was broadcast after regular programme finished and could also be loaded at any moment on teletext enabled TVs. Because teletext was made up of simple character blocks that displayed in a 40 by 25 screen layout in 8 colours, it used a very small amount of memory and bandwidth, making it easy to transmit over a standard TV aerial. In many ways this was like an early version of the internet, allowing you to load specific pages either by inputting the number, which went from 000 to 999, or by pressing one of the 4 coloured buttons to choose an on-screen option. Incidentally, this is where the red button that we use so much today comes from. Some pages were also interactive, allowing for things like simple quizzes or educational aids, while some would just display pages in sequence. The problem with this being that pages would only stay on screen for a set amount of time before swapping over, so if you hadn't read all the text, you would have to wait for that page to come around again. The Teletext terminal also allowed connection to Prestel, which was even more like an early version of the internet, as it allowed you to connect to various pages and databases through a modem and interact with both the service and other users in much the same way as you would on the internet of today. This was offered through a subscription service that had nearly 100,000 users at its peak. A key feature of the BBC Micro's design is the high-performance random access memory it's equipped with. A common design feature of many 6502-based computers of the era was to run the RAM at twice the clock rate as the CPU. This allowed a separate video display controller to access memory whilst the CPU is busy processing the data it just read. In this way, the CPU and graphics driver can share access to RAM through careful timing. However, not so in the BBC Micro, which was designed to run CPU speed at around twice the speed of other 6502 based computers of the time. Designer Steve Ferber believed that the Acorn design should have a flat memory model and allow the CPU and video system to access the bus without interfering with each other to increase performance. To do so, the RAM had to allow 4 million access cycles per second. And this was an issue, as at the time Hitachi was the only company that had produced DRAM running at that speed, the HM4816. In fact, this RAM was so rare and expensive at the time that to equip the prototype machine, only 4 HM4816s in the whole of the UK were hand delivered by a Hitachi representative to Acorn just in time for the BBC presentation. This is one of the key reasons the BBC Micro was so costly compared to its rivals, but was also the reason it outperformed most of its rivals in bench tests and became the first choice of many more serious UK computer users because of it. As great as the Beeb was, there was always one very big issue that meant it never had anywhere near the same level of success in homes as it had in schools: the price. At twice the cost of the Sinclair ZX Spectrum, even for the most basic model, it was well beyond the reach of most UK households, and so Acorn set about work on creating a lower cost alternative. They wanted this new computer to keep a high level of compatibility with the BBC Micro so they could use the same educational angle to help promote it and still be seen as a proper computer. So it was decided from day one that it would still feature a proper keyboard, unlike the awful dead flesh keys of the Spectrum, and a good level of expandability. So they needed to find other ways to save on the high cost of the hardware, and it was decided that a greatly reduced chipset was the answer. Acorn's engineers set about creating a completely new chipset that they claimed would reduce the count from the 102 chips on the BBC Micro's motherboard to just 14, with most of the functionality on a single 2400 gate uncommitted logic array, better known as a ULA. This computer would be called the Electron, keeping up with the naming theme introduced by the Atom and then the Proton. Acorn's boss, Chris Curry, who was famously immortalised by Martin Freeman in the excellent movie The Micromen, claimed that this new computer would be ready for Xmas 1982 for under £200. But the production of this new advanced ULA saw the Electron delayed numerous times, and it didn't hit the market until the end of the following year, and even then in very limited numbers, meaning it missed not just one but two vital Christmas sales periods. This saw many important retailers and distributors lose faith with Acorn, and the computer was never as successful as predicted, not just by Acorn but also the computing press of the time, who were very positive about the Electron indeed. Although the Electron eventually sold fairly well, meaning lots of software houses supported it, most of these were sold at heavily discounted prices, meaning Acorn made huge losses on the venture. And that leads us on very nicely to the next entry. The financial failure of the Electron meant that Acorn had to cancel their plans to expand into the lucrative North American market and seek new funding to stay afloat. In the end, Acorn's financial situation deteriorated so badly that in 1985 Italian electronics company Olivetti offered to rescue the company by taking up a 49.3% ownership stake. And this leads us on to a very obscure and rather unknown piece of the BBC Micro story. You see, as part of this deal, Olivetti promised to launch the Electron and BBC Micro in other European markets, including their own Italian homeland. But this didn't quite turn out as planned, as by year end the Electron could be found on clearance everywhere, and Olivetti were content with their existing European PC market and didn't fancy the risk of trying to bring another computer to an already crowded industry, especially when they would be required to find a new way to market it, given the Beeb was so intrinsically linked to UK schools and the British Broadcasting Corporation. However, to satisfy the terms of the deal and keep their new business partners happy, Olivetti did launch their own version of the BBC Master Compact in 1987, known as the ProDest 128S, Aimed at the home and small business market, this came bundled with a mouse and a host of productivity software, including Italian language versions of View, View Sheet, View Plot and View Index, along with a number of games including Aviator, Revs, Zor and Doctor Who in the Mines of Terror. Pricing for the Olivetti ProDesk PC128S started at 995,000 lira for a system with a monochrome monitor, or 1,295,000 lira with a colour monitor, equivalent to around 1,250 and 1,600 euros respectively, adjusted for inflation. These Olivetti branded Beebs were far from successful, although many at Acorn felt that the Italian company never even tried to sell it, and so they are extremely rare and sought after in the modern day. There was only one aspect of the BBC's original spec for a home computer that Acorn didn't manage to incorporate in the original design of the BBC Micro, and that was the ability to use the then industry standard CP/M operating system. But they quickly found a way round this by proposing an add-on for the Beeb that would be known as the Tube. Nicknamed the Cheese Wedge because of both its colour and design that saw it connect to the side of the BBC Micro, the Tube included a second processor in the form of a Zilog Z80 to give the BBC computer full CP/M compatibility. It would also include a host of custom chips and circuits, including a special Ferranti ULA that allowed it to interface with the 6502 inside the Beeb and its different bus. Many programs and indeed games, most notably Elite, were designed to detect the Tube and featured huge improvements thanks to its implementation. Although the Tube was initially created with a very specific task of giving the Beeb CP/M compatibility, later versions of the second processor unit were made with different CPUs inside, including a faster MOS 6502 and National Semiconductor 32016 processor running Panos, and Intel 80186 for very basic DOS compatibility, and even an early version of the now famous ARM chip, but more on that particular venture later. Originally there were just two models of the BBC Micro, the Model A and the Model B, the main difference being RAM, 16K and 32K respectively, but the latter also featured a printer interface too. The Model A could be easily upgraded to a Model B by adding an extra 16K of RAM and the missing MOS Technology 6522 VIA chip, which was not only used by the printer but also as a timer in many games and other programs. The Model A had such little usable RAM that it proved pretty pointless, with the vast majority of owners going for the school spec Model B instead. In 1984, Acorn's contract with the BBC was up for renewal, and the corporation was concerned that the current computers were not powerful enough to compete with new rivals on the market, and would need significant upgrades in order to fulfil the new parameters of the BBC computer literacy programme. Acorn promised that they would engineer a new version of the BBC Micro that would be fully backwards compatible with the previous ones in order to secure a renewal. The BBC were more than happy with the proposal, and this led to the creation of the BBC Micro Plus. This new model increased the RAM to 64K and then later 128K, as well as adding a new keyboard with a numerical keypad and a number of pretty important hardware revisions, including Shadow RAM and Sideways RAM, that would greatly improve speed and performance, as well as a revised ROM to access this. This did cause a few minor compatibility problems with some programs, but nothing too significant. In 1986, the Plus was replaced with a new model called the BBC Master. This would be the longest produced and in many ways most successful model of the BBC Micro, not being discontinued until 1994. This was widely used in schools, more so than the previous models, and indeed my own senior school had a network of 15 BBC Masters alongside an old BBC B, a BBC Master Compact and 3 Archimedes computers, but more on those later. Like the Plus, the Master came with 128K of RAM as standard, but could be upgraded to as much as 512K and also featured a host of previously optional upgrades as standard, including a faster Rockwell 65SC12 processor, as well as a new enhanced tube interface with a 3 MHz Intel 80186 instead of the Zilog Z80, and a host of built-in software, including a word processor, spreadsheet, disk filing system, and teletext. There were also a number of more minor revisions of the Master, including the Master Turbo and Master ET Ethernet terminal. But the most notable one was the BBC Master Compact, which I mentioned in the last segment. The reason why this one deserves special attention is the striking pizza box-like design, making it look a lot more like a PC. However, these were only ever produced in small numbers, and so are now very sought after by hardcore BBC Micro collectors. Although having BASIC built into the operating system was hardly new for an 8-bit computer, few, if any, did it better than the BBC Micro. The reasons for this are many, but I should start by pointing out that BBC BASIC was an enhanced version of the brilliant Acorn BASIC found in the Atom, which I talked about earlier on in this video. So let's look at the reasons why BBC BASIC is so good then, starting with the fact it had a built-in machine code assembler. This meant that once you'd mastered BASIC, you could move into learning machine code pretty seamlessly, and even combine the two. The ability to include machine code within BBC BASIC also made it much faster than many of its contemporaries. Another nice feature, which I myself found very useful indeed, was the ability to use shortened commands. So for example, you could simply type p dot instead of print, or l dot instead of list. It also has extra commands compared to the then industry-leading Microsoft BASIC, and allows full access to the hardware, including all graphics modes, expansion ports, and the 3-channel sound chip. The fact you can still find a variation of BBC BASIC on the Raspberry Pi computer says it all about this groundbreaking version of the popular programming language. Earlier in this video I talked about the Tube coprocessor add-on and how a later version of it was made that featured an early version of the ARM chip, and I'm sure that the vast majority of the people watching this are more than familiar with the significance of the low resource but high power ARM and its unbelievable legacy that has seen a modern day relative included in almost every mobile computing device out there, from iPhones to sat-navs, and its inclusion in that second processor unit was the testing ground for the chip whilst they continued the development of the computer that would truly harness its power, the Acorn Archimedes. Launched in 1987, the Archimedes was the 32-bit successor to the BBC Micro, and indeed there were several BBC branded models of the computer too, easily identified by the use of green on the case, as well as the more sedate looking Acorn units too. Although it was very much designed to compete with the PC and Apple Mac in the high-end business and productivity computer market, there were also later models whose looks were not too dissimilar to the Atari ST and Amiga, which it also hoped to compete with in the home market. All in all, a very wide range of different machines were released during its 10-year life, with it eventually being phased out in favour of the new Acorn RISC PC, which offered some backwards compatibility with the Archimedes, as well as full PC MS-DOS compatibility via an internal expansion card. Like the BBC Micro, the Archimedes could be found in many schools, but often alongside BBC Micros and research machine PCs, as RM now had the main contract to supply UK schools with MS-DOS based PCs, fast becoming the industry standard. This meant that the Archimedes was never as successful as the Beeb, sadly, in either the home or educational market, despite its immense power. The emergence of the PC compatible was obviously the biggest factor in the latter of those, with price proving a stumbling block when it came to home use, with most people plumping for the much cheaper, more games oriented Atari ST and Commodore Amiga instead. That said, its status as the very first ARM-powered RISC computer very much secures the legacy of the Archimedes in home computing history, and it was a very worthy successor to the equally incredible BBC Micro too.
Hi, Mum.
The average schoolchild hasn't really changed much over the years. But school has. The computer has arrived.
Under a government scheme, schools all over Britain are introducing microcomputers, and they're choosing one in particular, made by Acorn. As a result, the language it uses, called BBC Basic, has become the acknowledged computer language for schools. And now parents can catch up. For Acorn have produced a micro for the home that also uses BBC Basic. It's called the Electron. It's powerful, it's versatile, and it's only £199. So now your children can teach you all they know. The Acorn Electron can be found at larger W.H. Smith's or your local Acorn dealer. Just call 200 0200 for your nearest stockist.
And that rounds up my look at 10 amazing BBC Micro facts. But which of these fabulous facts was your favourite, or can you think of any other tantalising tidbits of trivia that I didn't include? We always love to hear the thoughts and views of my audience, so please get typing in that comment section. Before I go though, I must thank all of my loyal patrons who continue to support my channel and make videos like this possible. However, I must give special thanks to the following patrons and YouTube backers in particular for their much appreciated pledges: Paul Daniel, Mins, Dos Gamerman, Luke MC, Carl Olsen, Seth Robinson, Grady Haynes, Mark Strickland, Klimatorn, Trogdor the Burninator, Daniel Skronsky, Ben P. Stein, Tabby Kitsoon, Alan J. Dodds and Electron Star Collapse. If you also want to help support all my creative endeavours, including this YouTube channel, then please go and check out my Patreon right now, where you can get access to host extra content including downloads, exclusive videos, creative insights and much more besides. I've been the Laird, I thank you for watching and I'll see you all again for another video very soon.